We've talked a lot about the cult here on this channel. We've covered their potential members, their victims, and the eldritch god they worship. But we've spent little time discussing the organization itself, its history, its philosophy, and its importance from an analytical perspective. So to conclude my series of theories on this mysterious group, let's take a look at everything we know and think we know about the cult of the Black Goat. But before I go on, if you are a Night in the Woods fan, then please be sure to like, subscribe, and consider supporting me with a YouTube channel membership or over on Patreon. My dream is to make these videos full-time someday, and by doing any of those things, you'll be helping make that dream a reality. Fortunately, Night in the Woods tells us much of what we need to know about the cult during their final confrontation with May, meaning that, unlike some of my previous videos, there won't need to be as much speculation on this particular topic. According to the cult's unnamed leader, or at least the member who takes up speaking duties in this scene, the story of the cult begins in 1992. Big businesses, the factories and mining companies that had long served as the lifeblood of Possum Springs, left the United States, taking their operations overseas. This sent the town's economy into a tailspin. It was the end of the world in those days, as he puts it. And it probably did feel apocalyptic. Blue-collar jobs were what Possum Springs was known for, and it shaped the town's identity for over 100 years. Surely, most of the adult population of Possum Springs worked in those mines and factories, meaning that practically overnight, many of its citizens were without a source of income. Around that time, some bootleggers set up shop in the old copper mine out in the woods, which had long been abandoned due to its proximity to the poisoned water spring mentioned in the Harfest play. They fixed up the elevator and dug deep into the earth until at last Ed Scudder and Jim Dorney burst through a wall and found the now infamous bottomless pit, the hole at the center of everything. Jim fell into the hole, and Ed called out to him. Jim didn't answer, but something else, the Black Goat, did. Ed listened to the Black Goat, who instructed him to found the cult and continue feeding him. Many of those Ed turned to didn't believe him, but thanks to his gift of the glimmer, he was persuasive and eventually convinced at least a few folks to join him, some of whom remained with the cult until the very end. Together, they threw Tom Turner, who was a pretty awful person, according to the cult leader, into the pit. Soon after, the cult found flowers blooming again on the hills, felt like they were getting younger, and it seemed that the town's economy had stabilized as well. All of this they interpreted as signs that their sacrifice had worked, and thus the cult was formed. From then on, every time they heard the Black Goat sing, they went out into the town and kidnapped someone to serve as a sacrifice. By rule, they only target people who, quote, won't be missed, such as drunks, delinquents, and drifters. Over the years, they've tossed 39 people into the pit, including the aforementioned Tom Turner, the middle-aged man Lerv dismembered outside of the Click-Clack, the Harfest kid, and most heartbreaking of all, May's old friend, Casey Hartley. Obviously, the idea that no one is going to miss these people is a fallacy. Everyone has family or friends. Everyone would be missed by someone if they were suddenly taken from them, as evidenced by the posters Casey's parents put up around town, and the fact that May asks about him as often as she does. Of course, that matters little to the cult. To them, if you're an undesirable, if you're a so-called non-contributor, then they can't fathom why anyone would miss you, and thus, they believe they're doing you and the town a favor by tossing you into the pit. The number of people sacrificed by the cult is of interest to me, particularly when compared to the events of the game. If the cult has claimed the lives of 39 people since they were founded in 1992, 25 years before the events of Night in the Woods, then it means that they've tossed a little north of one person per year into the pit, or exactly 1.56 people per year for you math folks out there. But during the events of the game, the cult feeds the Harfest kid to the Black Goat on Halloween, and Lerv's armless victim a little over a week before that. And based on the missing persons posters, it appears Casey went missing on June 27th, just 4 months earlier. So in 2017, the cult sacrificed at least 3 people, twice their yearly average. So it's pretty clear that the Black Goat is singing more often than usual. This might suggest that it's getting impatient or only needs a few more sacrifices before it achieves its ultimate goal. But regardless, it definitely ramps up its activity in and around May's return to Possum Springs. In terms of how they go about kidnapping their victims, the cult members take turns going out into the town to find someone to sacrifice. I'd be willing to bet that they do this to cut down on the guilt and regret that comes along with their actions, to spread those ill feelings across the entire group rather than center them in one place. But I might be giving the cult too much credit on that one, because aside from this dude here, they show little remorse for the terrible things they've done. Presumably, everyone who's done the kidnapping has their own methodology. For example, as I theorized in my last video, Lerv might have used a bear trap on his victim, explaining the severed arm. Of course, no one has it easier than Ide, who can walk through walls and disappear. It's perplexing to me that the cult doesn't just use him to round up all of their victims. They'd probably have an easier time staying hidden. But then again, these people aren't exactly strategic geniuses. The cult leader is by no means Commissar Yarrick. This lack of efficiency is made clear not only by the severed arm itself, but the way the cult talks about it. During May's first run-in with the cult, when the cult's leader is chastising Lerv for leaving the arm outside of the Click-Clack, he mentions that Lerv has, quote, been on the other side of this before. To me, this implies that this isn't the first time someone has left evidence behind at the scene. Maybe not something as ostentatious as a dismembered limb, but other signs that someone culted here. So clearly, even after 25 years of kidnapping and sacrificing so-called undesirables, the cult is far from a well-oiled machine. May probably isn't the first person to pick up on their trail, just the last. As pointed out by Diz Brony, who commented on my previous video, this could also indicate that arms are severed from the cult's victims and used in a separate ritual, perhaps as a burnt offering, before the rest of the corpse is thrown into the pit. Thus, because Lerv failed to deliver the arm, the sacrifice wasn't truly complete. I really like this theory. It doubles as a callback to the events of Lost Constellation, where Adina Astra had to burn the severed arm of a criminal, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if that's what the cult leader is talking about here, not the fact that they left the arm behind in the first place. It would also help explain some of his anger and urgency in this scene, as he's not just scared that they'll be discovered or exposed, but that they failed to live up to their deal with the Black Goat. One of Diz's larger points in his comment is the idea that the cult likely partakes in other rituals that we don't know about, a belief that is supported by the pews and the church-like setup May and her friends find when they first enter the Black Goat's lair. This implies that the cult doesn't just toss people into the pit and go back home to watch InfoWars, but that they truly do worship the Eldritch being in a mass-like ceremony. Perhaps the sacrifice is just the last sacrament of this macabre ceremony. In any case, the cult believes that if they keep doing this, if they keep feeding the Black Goat, then Possum Springs will one day return to its former glory. The factories will come back, the mines will start running again, and young people will stop leaving for greener pastures. If they don't, they believe the town will fall apart and be reduced to nothing but an empty field, like May sees in her dreams after her first confrontation with the cult. Of course, the natural question here is whether or not these sacrifices are actually accomplishing anything at all, if the Black Goat is in fact using its eldritch magic to bring the good old days back to Possum Springs. And the answer is a resounding no. The Food Donkey is a Dark Souls-style ruin that creepy weirdos like Steve Scriggins squat in. Beloved family businesses like Possibilities are closing their doors for good, and the town's young people dream of moving to places like Bright Harbor. They might be feeling younger, and I wouldn't be shocked if serving the Black Goat has kept them alive and in good health longer than usual. But it's obviously not extending their lifespans all that much, because Ed Scudder seems to be dead, and part of the reason the cult is offering a welcoming hand to May and her friends at all is because they know they're getting older and need to bring new blood into the group. So their claims that these sacrifices are somehow saving the town are frankly ridiculous. Neither them nor Possum Springs are benefiting from their relationship with the cult. The cult isn't getting much of anything from the Black Goat. They're being used by it. They sold their souls for nothing but a few extra years of good health, not the resurrection of their beloved town. This, of course, is classic Lovecraftian storytelling. A powerful godlike being taking advantage of a desperate group of people to increase its own power and further its own designs. Exactly what the Black Goat wants is unclear, as it always is with beings of this nature, but it's definitely closer to achieving its own goals than the cult is to theirs. Ironically, the fact that Possum Springs is still a ghost town has helped the cult cover their tracks. With everyone leaving town in search of a better life, it's easy for people to believe that Casey just hopped a train and went somewhere else. If the town was on the upswing, disappearances like this would stick out like a severed arm, and it would be harder for the cult to hide what they're up to. In terms of membership, there are only 4 confirmed members of the cult. We've already talked about Lerv, but during the scene where the cult is about to execute him, he calls out to 3 members by name: Dave, Rick, and Benny. In my video on May's neighbors, I speculated that Rick might be Mr. Twigmire, but that's a theory that required a lot of heavy lifting, and certainly isn't one I'd take to the bank. As pointed out by Roxy Lozada in a comment on that video, Rick might be Rick Wreckage, a cut character who never made his way into the finished game. I typically don't reference cut content for these theories, and I actually wasn't going to mention him at all for that reason. But Roxy Lozada noticed that he is mentioned by Greg during a conversation between him and May on Messenger, which suggests that the character still exists in this universe in some form. So perhaps Rick is in fact Rick Wreckage after all. The identities of other cult members are purely speculative, but I think it's likely that Mr. Twigmire, if he isn't Rick, is still a cult member due to his rather suspicious dialogue at the beginning of the game and in May's dream. I'm also confident in saying that Hank Anderson, the town's only doctor, and Dan McConnell, a police officer who frequently works with Molly and might have helped her find May in the woods after her first confrontation with the cult, are likely members as well. My findings on Bee's father, who is noticeably absent from his spot on the couch during the pre-epilogue scene, are inconclusive, and I have to admit that I go back and forth on him constantly. There's good evidence on both sides, and barring an opportunity to ask Scott Benson himself about this scene, I don't think we'll ever get any clear answers on that front. Though they definitely aren't full-fledged members, I think it's likely that Gary and Colleen, 2 of the city council members, at least support their actions based on various statements they make throughout the game. Plenty of people have speculated about Aunt Molly, despite her presence in the epilogue, but as I see it, I think she just knows that something sinister is going on in Possum Springs, but can't quite put the pieces together. I doubt that's true for the rest of the police department, however, who might have more members in their ranks than just Dan McConnell, as evidenced by the timeline of events leading up to Lerv's execution. Demographically, cult members appear to be conservative-minded, as evidenced by the statements of their leader, and are likely middle-aged, probably in their 40s or 50s. People in this age bracket would have been at the start of their working careers in the early 90s, when big businesses left Possum Springs, and thus would have been among those most affected by the economic strife that struck the town. However, it's important to note that this does not mean that all of the cult members were miners and factory workers. In fact, I'm willing to bet that most of them weren't. B straight up asked the cult leader if any of them lost their jobs when the mines and factories left, and his non-answer here speaks volumes. Still, anyone living in Possum Springs at the time would have been affected by the economic downturn to some degree, which is likely what inspired the majority of the membership, who probably worked white-collar office jobs around town, to join the cult, meaning that B's fantastic question is more about cementing the cult's hypocrisy than anything else. In terms of their organizational structure, it's hard to say whether or not the person speaking for the cult is the same in both scenes, but it probably is, and I think it's safe to assume that he's either their leader or one of their leaders. He's also responsible for the big membership pitch to May and her friends, which certainly indicates a high level of authority. I can't imagine the cult would trust just anyone to allow new blood into their ranks. Ide, despite his top billing in the story, doesn't appear to have much pull within the group. The cult leader talks down to him and doesn't even consider his protests when he lets May and her friends go. He also doesn't appear to listen to the group much at all. There's no evidence that Ide was instructed to keep an eye on May. He appears to have followed her and her ghost hunting tour of his own volition, which would seem to indicate that he spends much of the game going rogue, just as he does in his final moments. All of this feeds into my theory that he's a descendant, probably the grandson of Ed Scudder, as evidenced by their shared ability to walk through walls. This, I suspect, is why he's so willing to go against the orders of the older members in the group. In his mind, he's superior to them because he has the Glimmer, and because his grandfather founded the cult in the first place. He feels that he knows the Black Goat better than any of them, and thus feels that he doesn't need to listen to them. Ultimately, Ide's refusal to follow orders is what proves to be the cult's undoing. I suppose it's possible that his attack on May outside of the elevator was something that the cult leader asked him to do, like a gangster luring his victims into a false sense of security before dealing a killing blow. But everything we've seen from Ed Scudder's grandson suggests that he's shooting from the hip here. During his fight with May, the elevator comes crashing down on him, cutting off his arm and trapping everyone, himself, the other cult members, and our protagonist and her friends, down in the mines. Though May, Greg, Angus, and Bee escape through the old well, the very same formerly poisoned spring mentioned in the Harfest play, and end up in the woods outside Germ's house, the fate of Ide and the other cultists is unclear. Naturally, the question is, if our protagonist and her comrades found their way to safety, then is it possible that the cult members did so as well? Personally, despite the assertions of the cult burner account that comments on my videos, I think this is unlikely, for several reasons. First, let's start with Ide. Thanks to the Glimmer and his ability to walk through walls, I can understand why some folks might suspect that he found his way to freedom. But the last time we saw him, he just got Luke Skywalkered, and unlike that noble Jedi Knight, he didn't lose his limb to a lightsaber, so the wound wasn't cauterized, and he'd certainly have no means to do so while trapped down in the mines. So even if Ide used his powers to escape the mine, I'm pretty confident in saying that Ide probably bled to death within the hour. I think this works from a thematic perspective as well, as Ide himself comes full circle, with his hubris bringing an end to the cult his grandfather started nearly 30 years earlier. As for the other cult members, there appears to be only one way in and one way out of the pit where the Black Goat resides, meaning that with the elevator destroyed, they were likely trapped down there with the Eldritch God. It's gruesome to think about, but though it's hard to say how the cult would handle this predicament, if they'd end up following in the footsteps of the Donner Party or David's gang from The Last of Us, I theorize that they probably did what they always do when presented with a problem, and turned to the Black Goat. It's easy for me to imagine them sacrificing each other to it one by one, until only one member was left to either jump into the pit himself or starve to death down in the mines. All of this, of course, begs another question. If the cult did take turns throwing each other into the pit, then how did this affect the Black Goat? Well, as I mentioned earlier, it certainly seems like it was singing more often than usual lately. Why it was doing this is unclear, but if it was because it was growing in power and only needed a few more sacrifices to achieve its goal, then by trapping the cult down in the mines, May might have inadvertently given the Black Goat exactly what it wanted. Perhaps, after feeding on the cult and everyone else who's been tossed into the pit over the years, the Black Goat is at last strong enough to not only influence the people of Possum Springs, but the surrounding area as well. Perhaps this would have been a part of the plotline for a sequel, with the Black Goat following May as she tries to start a new life for herself out in Bright Harbor. That'd be one hell of a hook for Night in the Woods too, but unfortunately, that's a game we'll probably never get to see. Now, if that's what we know about the cult from a theoretical point of view, then what do we know about them from an analytical perspective? All of that was lore and world building, but now let's take a look at the metaphor at play here. As many have pointed out over the years, the cult's political philosophy, their views on immigrants, on the importance of preserving the past at any cost, and the belief that anyone who doesn't, quote, contribute to society is an undesirable, is distinctly Trumpian. But Night in the Woods was released in February 2017, meaning that the game, in large part, was written before he ever kicked off his presidential campaign. So if the cult's ideology isn't a reference to Trump, then who or what is it a reference to? Their viewpoints, coupled with the history of Possum Springs, is, in my view, a reflection of the demographic shift that took place in Rust Belt politics over the last 30 years. For generations, since roughly the time of FDR, The Rust Belt was a region full of what many political scientists referred to as ancestral Democrats. Generally speaking, this term refers to blue-collar workers who supported the Democratic Party because they were typically pro-union, at least compared to Republicans. But over time, the power of unions waned, and when the factories and mining operations went overseas and those blue-collar workers lost their jobs, it was the final straw for many of them. They felt abandoned by the Democratic Party, which is probably what the cult leader is referring to when he says that politicians, quote, just wanted their votes. And instead of blaming the people truly responsible for the departure of the mines and factories, namely the rich business moguls who moved them to countries where they could legally treat their workers as poorly as they used to treat the people of Possum Springs back in the 1800s, they did what people so often do when faced with adversity, and blamed the other, the outcasts, the immigrants, and so-called non-contributors. Thus, when Trump came along, he didn't create this sentiment, he merely exposed it, and accelerated a shift in political alignments that had already been in the works for quite some time. And in the case of Night in the Woods, the cult isn't inspired by Trump so much as their rhetoric foreshadowed what was to come. As mentioned earlier, despite their 39 sacrifices to the black goat, Possum Springs isn't getting any better. It's still a rapidly decaying ghost town. The young people are leaving in droves, and the factories and mining operations aren't coming back. This only strengthens the metaphor at play here. Not even an eldritch entity can turn the clocks back for the town. It's time for Possum Springs to move on, to become something different, to find a new identity. That's easier said than done, of course, but there are things the cult could do to improve the town that are staring them right in the face. They could help family businesses like Postability stay afloat, join Stan on the picket lines as he tries to start up a union at Ham Panther, or support community members who are truly struggling, like Bruce and Bee's father, or even help young people like Danny find a job. All of this would help the community, help the people already living in Possum Springs, keep them in the area, and maybe even bring in a new family or two. There are plenty of good people in the town who literally can't leave, like Bee, stuck working at her father's store, and Candy Borowski, who took up a second job to pay the mortgage, who deserve a hopeful version of Possum Springs, not one desperate to relive past glory. But instead, these evil uncles have started a murder cult that's feeding their fellow citizens to an eldritch entity. It's an act that's vile and heinous, no matter what the circumstances might be. But to make matters worse, the Black Goat isn't even listening to their prayers or bringing prosperity back to Possum Springs at all. They've sold their souls for nothing. They feared death, so they fed their young to the Black Goat when it was time to let old things die and find peace in the hope for a different future. Instead, they went looking for the gods and died in a lonely cave. Thank you for watching what is officially my longest video on Night in the Woods, and the end to my first video series here on YouTube. Before I get into my usual thank yous, there's a lot I'd like to say. I started making these videos as a bit of a Hail Mary, to get out of my burnout job and to help my rapidly growing family find a new home. My early videos didn't make much headway, didn't really catch the winds of the algorithm, until I published my video on Greg a year ago tomorrow. That video was a Hail Mary among Hail Marys. I said to my wife right before posting it that if it didn't do well, then I was going to stop making YouTube videos entirely and take up a second job come the summer to help support our dreams. And now, my channel is growing every day, and slowly becoming exactly the type of place I'd always hoped it would be, a hub for all of the games I love. And as you can probably tell, there are a lot of those, spanning a whole spectrum of genres. But I can't thank the Night in the Woods community enough for embracing me, for allowing me to become a standard bearer for this community. I don't know what lies ahead for us, especially with the cancellation of Revenant Hill, but I'm hoping that Fall of Porcupine was the first in a slew of Night in the Woods-like games to come. Hell, if you're a game developer out there and want to get to work on one, I'd love to help. I can't program, but as you can tell, I can write, and I've long had an idea for a spiritual successor that I'd be happy to share with the right collaborator. Regardless, this is not the end of my Night in the Woods coverage. Many folks have asked me how long I plan to keep covering the game, and the answer is, as long as I can. With the Theory series done, I'll be moving on to videos about hidden secrets in the game, or connections to Pittsburgh and the Rust Belt. My character analysis series will continue as well. I have several more important folks to get through before I cap it all off with a video on May, probably sometime in the fall. And at some point, I will be getting back to covering theories on the game. For example, there are theories about the gas leaks, and that they might be causing May's dreams and not the Glimmer. It runs contrary to my cult theory, but I'd still like to cover it at some point. And speaking of this cult theory, later down the line, I'll be compiling the findings of every entry in the series in the form of a cohesive lore video, similar to VaatiVidya's incredible Prepare to Cry series. It will be more of a story format, supported by a ton of custom art. It's the type of thing that will likely take a long time to put together, but I can't wait to get to work on it. Either way, if you're still watching this video and listening to me ramble, thank you so much. This has become a true second job for me, and though it'll probably take some time to get there, I do believe it'll become a full-time gig eventually. I find myself dreaming of that day more and more. Huge thanks to Jordy J. Morales Moreno for providing me with the art for my channel, and Wolf Godwin for the music for my videos. Big shout out to James Pruitt, Raven Lampkin, Corey Matson, Gustavo Balabi, Reed, and Pathonian, who get early access to my videos thanks to donations of $5 to $10 a month. Take care, and I'll see you guys again next week.